Alright, so we're going to combine a few chapters from your textbook into basically one concise set of information that you need to know about evolution for the AP Biology exam. So the first thing you need to know is a little bit about Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. So Darwin came up with this theory of natural selection after he traveled to the Galapagos Islands. He saw a lot of things there. One of the things that you'll hear about him is that he studied tortoises in the Galapagos Islands and that he saw these fossils in the cliff sides. And the fossils showed that there had been this sort of gradual change over time in the ancient tortoises from the Galapagos and then the ones that were living there at the time. And so he came up with a lot of things. He talked about how the Earth had to be a lot older than it was originally thought and how these changes had occurred over time. And he came up with what's called natural selection. Another guy named Wallace actually came up with the same theory about the same time. So natural selection relies on a few things. First of all, natural selection says that there's already genetic variation across members of a population. In other words, everybody isn't the same. The second thing that natural selection relies on is that more offspring are born than actually survive and reproduce. For example, if we were to look at the population of possums in South Florida, possums have about, I don't know, something like 20 to 30 babies at a time. If every female possum had the maximum number of offspring that she could have every couple of months, another 30 babies or whatever, there would be no room for anything else on the planet. The same is true for example, mushrooms. Mushrooms growing in your yard release, say, 1,000 spores. If every spore landed, sprouted, and grew into another mushroom, the world would be so covered with mushrooms there would be no room for anything else. So clearly, not every organism that's born is going to make it. More offspring are born than survive. Next, there's competition. In other words, there's not enough food, water, shelter, mates, all of those things to go around. So you put all of this together, what we see is individuals that have the best traits genetically tend to be the ones that survive the longest, and therefore they live longer, they're going to have more babies, and they're going to pass on those good traits. So this is the idea of natural selection, and therefore over time the population is going to change to where more and more individuals in the population show those good traits. Now, is this the only thing that happens? No. Sometimes an organism dies by chance and it has nothing to do with their traits being bad. Sometimes mutations happen. All kinds of other things can occur. This is one thing, and you have to understand that natural selection does not take into account accidental deaths. It does not take into account where do these traits originally come from, which is mutations. This is only speaking about if a trait does appear in a population, does that trait live on and get passed to the next generation, or does that trait die out because it's a bad trait? So that's the idea of natural selection. So traits that are good are going to tend to get passed on. Natural selection also says, and this is important, that evolution doesn't act on individuals. If it suddenly got really, really, really cold, I'm not going to grow fur to survive. But the human race might still survive if this, imaginary cold thing happened, because some people might have more body hair, might have more body fat. And those genetic traits of carrying more body fat and having more body hair might be beneficial traits. So 100 years later, we come back and look at the human race after this event, and people are hairier and heavier. Is it because everybody grew hair and got fat? No, it's because the people that genetically had those traits survived, passed those traits on, and so the population changed. Not the individuals, but the population. So evolution acts on populations. And one of the mechanisms by which that happens is natural selection. Okay, on the AP exam, it's very common that they'll show you a before and an after graph and ask you questions about what happened. And what they're looking at is there are three kind of basic categories for natural selection. The first one is called directional selection. So directional selection is where one extreme is best. So an example that was done on this was this study on what was called the peppered moth. And there's actually some flaws in this study that I'm not going to get into, but honestly it still fits as a decent example of this. I could come up with other examples. So the idea is, if you look at this graph down here, the original population of moths consisted more of lighter speckled moths than darker moths, even though there was a range. So there were light moths and there were dark moths. The idea was that supposedly the lighter moths blended with the bark on the trees, and therefore they were less likely to get captured by predators. So dark moths existed, but since they were tending to get eaten more often, there weren't as many of them. They weren't living as long, they weren't passing that trait on. The Industrial Revolution came about, and it killed off the what are called lichens that were growing on the tree trunks. So the tree trunks basically got darker. And so when the tree trunks got darker, now being a lighter moth wouldn't be so good anymore. Now a darker moth would blend with the trees better. And so over time, what happened is the population that started over here shifted in one direction. And this is called directional selection. Not because the light moths, individual light moths, turned dark, but the light moths now started to get eaten. More dark ones were living longer, having more offspring, and so now the population shifted towards there being darker moths. So directional selection, anytime you see a graph where it goes in one direction, that's going to be directional selection. So you could have, for example, tall and short, and this is the before graph. And then in the after graph, we see that it shifts towards tall. That would be directional selection. Or if it shifted towards short, that would also be directional selection. So that's our first kind of natural selection. The second kind of natural selection is what's called stabilizing selection. So stabilizing selection kind of keeps a population stable. So we've talked about this before. Sickle cell anemia in Africa. If you're big B, you're normal. If you're big B, little b, you carry sickle cell anemia gene, but you don't have very many traits of sickle cell. I believe there are some mild symptoms. So I'll just put mild here. And if you're little b, you have sickle cell anemia, which is bad. So if you live in this remote area of Africa and you actually are little b, your chances of survival are lower. So you are more likely to die. Well, you would think then what we would see would be directional selection, that we would shift towards the people who don't carry the gene at all, since you do have some mild symptoms. But what they discovered was people who were big B, little b, heterozygous, had an increased chance of survival of malaria. Malaria is carried by mosquitoes, and it's very common in Africa. And if you catch malaria and you don't live in an area where there's a lot of medical intervention, you're also very likely to die. So people who were big B, also had a higher chance of dying because they were more likely to get malaria. People who carry the sickle cell gene have very few symptoms of sickle cell and were resistant to catching malaria, so they're more likely to survive. So what happens over time? The population favors people who carry the gene. So you see less people who are big B, less people who are little b, and even more people who are heterozygous. And this graph here is another example. It's talking about a fly called a gall fly. Basically, the gall flies range in size from very small to very big, and this is genetic. Wasps eat the little ones, and woodpeckers eat the big ones. Therefore, what's going to happen is the ones that are going to tend to survive the best are going to be the ones who are medium-sized, which means they're going to pass on the trait of being medium-sized, which means the population is going to stay in the middle. So this is stabilizing selection. The last kind of natural selection is called disruptive selection. Disruptive selection is where two extremes are favored. So imagine you have a population of rabbits. And my original population looks like this, and I have some that are white, and some that are tan, and some that are very dark brown. And let's say that the way that the environment changes is that there's a lot of grassy areas that are brownish, and there's a lot of sandy areas that are very whitish. So maybe this is a beach area. Well, what's going to happen is the ones that are white are camouflaged in the beachy area. The ones that are dark are camouflaged in the grassy area, but the ones that are tan aren't camouflaged anywhere. They don't blend with the beach or the grass. Then what might happen over time is we might actually see this population end up splitting into two. In other words, it gets disrupted. So this is disruptive selection. Now we end up with a population of all dark ones, a population of all light ones, and eventually we may get to a point where these are actually separate species, where these two populations no longer even interact with each other because the tan ones don't survive well anyway. And so we see two populations split from one. So that is called disruptive selection. So those are our three kinds of natural selection. again, it's very likely on the AP exam that they could give you a before and after graph and ask you, what kind of selection was going on. And so, again, if it shifts in one direction towards either the tallest or the shortest, that's directional. If it tends to favor intermediate, that's stabilizing, keeping things stable. And if it tends to split the population, that's disruptive.